Hello again, and thanks for coming back for another episode in our ongoing video series, The Vinyl Review. This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and if this is the first time that you've ever visited us here on our channel, well, then welcome, and we're glad that you tuned in. What we have here is kind of a hybrid program where we go in a chronological order through albums that were released beginning back at the end of 1964. We started with this one right here with the Beatles. And so we're just going to keep moving forward through history until we simply run out of records to review, or else time just catches up with us. And when I say hybrid, what I mean is that we not only talk about and review a given album in great detail, but we also talk quite a bit about the history of each of these bands and or these performers. Because what you're going to find out as you watch this program is that none of these album releases exist in a vacuum. And they are like little time capsules of history. They represent what these musicians may have been going through at the time and up to the point of when the album in question was released. So, if you like music and you like history, well, then you're in the right place. And so, here we go with episode number 7. And before I even mention the album or the name of the band that we're focusing on in this episode, let me preface all of this with just a very short setting of time and place. By the end of 1963, America and Americans were going through a very difficult period in the history of our nation. In November of 1963, we experienced the assassination of a very popular and a very charismatic president, John F. Kennedy. The entire country all but completely shut down for about 4 days as everyone watched on television the coverage of the horse-drawn carriage that carried his casket back to the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson solemnly took the oath as the 36th president, standing directly next to Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline. And then the world watched in utter horror and dismay on live television as the alleged killer of the president, Lee Harvey Oswald, was also in turn shot and killed by a man named Jack Ruby as he was being led from the police headquarters in Dallas to a waiting armored car that was going to take him to a jail cell. There was unrest in the deep south of the United States as blacks were protesting their lack of basic human and civil rights. Many protesters were severely beaten by police just as a matter of routine, and many were even killed. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was still raging, and the Bay of Pigs incident in Cuba had recently brought the entire world to the brink of nuclear war and utter destruction. Another war was beginning in an area that many Americans had never even heard of, in the far-off Southeast Asian country of Vietnam. No one really knew at that point just how deeply involved the United States would become in that conflict, nor did we have any idea of just how long it would actually go on. All in all, the citizens of the United States, by the early months of 1964, were really in no mood at all for music that would remind them of the constant turmoil that was going on all around them. And most people at that time really preferred to listen to popular music as a way to feel a sense of hope, joy, and happiness, and as a way to escape temporarily the constant bad news that they were being bombarded with on a daily basis. We did have folk music that served as messages of protest from artists such as Joan Baez and, of course, Bob Dylan. But this music was not considered to be top 40 radio hits, and it wasn't really being widely played throughout the United States at that time. If you wanted this kind of music to be in your life, well, then you had to go out and buy it on record. Baez and Dylan were certainly very well known, and they were well respected. But their music was viewed not so much as just simple entertainment, but more as a beacon of truth, and just cold hard reality put into poem and song. Now, you would think that after that short American history lesson there from the mid-1960s, that our point here would be to introduce you to an American musical group from that same time period. But that is not the case. The band that we're going to talk about in great depth today is actually a British group from the city of Manchester, located in the north of England. They called themselves Herman's Hermits. So, why are we talking so much about the United States and its own troubled history? The reason is because this particular band found the majority of their success not in their own home country, but actually more so in the United States. They were very popular in England, but they were for a very short time a phenomenon in America. For a time span of about 36 months between February of 1964 and early 1967, this group managed to log over a dozen top 40 hits in the United States, and they had roughly about half that number of big hits in the UK during that same period of time. In the year 1965, Herman's Hermits sold more albums worldwide than the Beatles did. The biggest question is why? Many of you out there have probably heard of them, especially if you are of a certain age. But there's probably also a whole lot of you out there just scratching your heads right now and saying to yourself, who in the flip are the Herman's Hermits? And you know what? That's okay. It's understandable. Before we even get anywhere near the part about rating this album right here, I think it's safe for us to say that this music did not stand the test of time. It had its brief shining moment in the sun, and a few people made a lot of money from these hit songs. Whatever. And you know what? Good for them. But this kind of music is fluff. It's bubblegum pop. And that's all it was ever really designed to be. It was safe, and it was happy, and it was fun. It was non-confrontational, and it threatened no one. I mean, just take a look at these guys. Your mom would like this music. Your Aunt Thelma and her 27 cats likes this music right now. And it was what the people in the United States wanted at that time. It's very simple. The people wanted it, and they got it. And then, when they didn't want it, and they got tired of it, well, then they just moved on to something else or the next big thing. Look, it's not like we don't have music exactly like this today, right now. We do. I'm not here to judge these guys too harshly, and their music doesn't bother me, but I'm also not going to lie. After this particular episode is finished, and the review portion is over, and the video is uploaded to YouTube, I really don't think that I am ever going to put Herman's Hermits back on the turntable ever again. I'm just too old and just way too cynical for this kind of music anymore. Sorry, but that is just really the truth. And like I always say on this series, if you like the music that we're reviewing and we don't always say the things that you agree with or that you want to hear, that's perfectly fine. You have every right to listen to or enjoy whatever you want to. Guilty pleasure or not, musical therapy, whatever. We don't take commercial success into any consideration when we compile a final rating for these records. What we actually do, however, is we break down each and every single song on every record into a total of 49 different artistic and technical aspects of a song, and in the fairest and in the most unbiased way we possibly can, we calculate a final score. And whatever it turns out to be is what it is. We listen to the individual musical performances, the vocals, the drums, the kazoo, if there is one, etc. And we try to find the hidden meanings or the cultural references, if there are any, within the lyrics. We even listen to the overall quality of the sound recording, always trying to keep in mind the era in which they were recorded in, of course. We judge a band or a group more harshly if they sound as if they were copying some other well-known band at the time, or if they're just shamelessly trying to jump onto some trend or a bandwagon for commercial reasons, or if they're just stubbornly clinging to something that is way past its sell-by date. So please, don't be offended if your favorite records get a grade lower than you think they deserve. Because, truth be told, even though we're only on episode 7 at the moment, we have already graded several dozen records so far. And some of the grades that we came up with for some very well-known releases by some big-name groups were actually very surprising. And also, it really shows just how difficult it is to actually make a fantastic record from top to bottom. A great record is a rarity, and it has to be solid from track 1 all the way to the final track on side 2. So, with all of that in mind for now, let's take a quick look at this group's history and their origins, and let's talk about where they came from. And all the while, we're going to try to answer that one big question, and that was, why was this band so successful during this time? And why were they so successful in the United States in particular? Also, why did they just seem to fall off the face of the earth by the early part of 1967? So, let's do this. Here we go. Manchester, like we previously mentioned, is a city in the UK, located in what is considered to be the northern portion of England. And much like many of the cities in the northern half of England, it was an industrial area that specialized in the manufacturing of textiles, for example, turning cotton into clothing or furniture upholstery. As the Second World War began, Manchester's factories were mobilized into the manufacturing of bombs and bullets and tanks. And these factories were running 24/7 around the clock, pumping black smoke and soot into the skies, and they were dumping toxic chemicals into the River Irwell. And much like the heavily industrialized city of Newcastle, which we just talked about extensively in the episode right before this one, Manchester was bombed repeatedly by the Nazis who were targeting these factories. This city was hit with over 37,000 aerial bombs on just a single night, Christmas Eve in 1940. Half of the entire city was all but destroyed on that date, and over 600 civilians in Manchester were killed on the night before Christmas. After the war was over, the city was extensively rebuilt, but the industrial boom was also over, and gradually this city went into a major economic decline, with many areas becoming notoriously slummy, full of abandoned factories and decrepit old buildings that were unsightly and unsafe. Now, when I think of the city of Manchester, I think about music. I think about Joy Division, the Smiths, the Fall, and New Order. But I also think about the books and the writings of Sheila Delaney, like A Taste of Honey, The Lion in Love, and The White Bus. She was a brilliant writer in the post-war era who wrote about the people of Manchester and nearby Salford, and she documented their struggles with poverty and depression and feelings of overwhelming hopelessness. I don't necessarily think about the music of Herman's Hermits when I think of Manchester, mainly because the nature of their music, with its happy-go-lucky feelings of innocence and teenage puppy love, just seems strangely out of place when you realize the environment from where they originated. Sheila Delaney wrote about the kitchen sink realism of what it was really like to grow up in poverty on the dirty streets of Salford, whereas Herman's Hermits were singing songs with lyrics such as these. Quote, "Woke up this morning feeling fine. There's something special on my mind. Last night, I met a new girl in the neighborhood. Whoa, yeah. Something tells me that I'm into something good." Unquote. Okay, so how about this one? "Oh, I'd love to love you. You know I think you're out of sight. But first, I've got to be sure that you're going to treat me right. And if you really care, and you're not just wasting my time, come on and show me, girl. Show me that you're really mine." Now, that one's actually almost a little bit provocative. And it sounds to me kind of like a cross between like maybe a Buddy Holly song and, I don't know, like Justin Bieber or something. Granted, Herman's Hermits are not writing these songs. This is mainly a cover band with an occasional song written by Keith Hopwood, who also served as the rhythm guitarist in the Hermits. And by the way, those two songs that I just quoted to you were actually written by Carole King and her soon-to-be husband, Jerry Goffin, while she was still just a teenager. So my point here is not to just simply make fun of what seems to sound like just average, run-of-the-mill teeny bopper lyrics. I'm actually trying to point out to you how odd it was for a band from Manchester in the 1960s to just be so upbeat and happy all the time. And kudos to them for that. Seriously. Let's meet the band. After going through several different early lineup changes, Herman's Hermits were formed roughly in about July of 1963. Okay, and so I read this book right here, which was written by the man who first discovered them playing in a small youth club in the Manchester suburb, small town known as Urmston. It was called the Collingwood Club, and he would ultimately become not only their manager, but also the man who essentially would guide them from one success to the next one. He protected them from would-be predators, both professional and non-professional predators, and who served as more of like their older brother or a father figure to them, even though he was only 23 years old at this time himself. He was an amateur musician who had tried his hand at songwriting, but ultimately he gave that up pretty quickly when he convinced himself that he was never going to be as good as John Lennon or Paul McCartney. And then he also realized that he seemed to possess a much greater skill at spotting would-be talents and then figuring out how to successfully manage them. He was, of course, caught up in the whole Liverpool Merseybeat scene of the Cavern Club, the Beatles, the Searchers, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Freddie and the Dreamers, etc. And if you want to know more about that whole scene, please go back and watch our episode number 4 for a very in-depth look at Liverpool and what was going on there at that time. Now, back to Manchester. In 1963, musically speaking, this city was not Liverpool, and Manchester did not have bragging rights to a group like the Beatles the way that Liverpool did. These two cities are really only about 30 miles apart, and they have been historically competitive with one another, dating back to times that were way, way long before this. And so, initially, Harvey Lisberg just wanted to find some local group that looked way cooler than he ever would have on a stage, and who also might be interested in performing or recording some of these songs that he had written. This is why he went to see this unknown band in the first place. I don't think he was ever planning to actually manage them. So, here is a very early picture of lead singer Peter Noone. And just in case you're wondering why he seems to look like just a boy, well, that's because he is. When future manager Harvey Lisberg first saw this band performing in the summer of 1963, Peter Noone was all of but just 15 years old. The other guys in the band at that time were just a bit older than he was, but they were all still teenagers themselves, ranging in age from about 17 to 19. The thing about that very first encounter, according to Lisberg, was not so much that Peter Noone seemed to be an incredibly impressive singer, but it was that he had an entire room full of possibly as many as 200 screaming teenage girls that were just going absolutely bananas for him. Lisberg claims that there wasn't a single other male in that audience that night other than himself. What he didn't realize at that time was that although Peter Noone was only a boy of 15, he was no newcomer to the idea of being on stage, to singing, or being the center of attention in a big room. In fact, Peter Noone was a bit of a child prodigy in that he had already been a minor television star with a small but a recurring role on the very popular British sitcom known as Coronation Street. He had originally been cast in that role when he was only 12. Noone had also been a very young student in voice and drama at the Manchester School of Music, where he was winning awards such as Outstanding Young Musician of the Year, and he was considered to be a young star in the making, just waiting for the right opportunities to come his way. Peter Noone was polished. He was polite, talented, friendly, and gregarious. He was charismatic and quite nice-looking in a very non-threatening way. This also endeared him to the older women and the mothers of these teenage girls as well. People just simply liked him. And he had a trained voice that was perfectly suitable for the music that was popular amongst the kids his age in Manchester at that time. The band covered Beatles songs back then as part of their act, as well as songs by Buddy Holly, Bobby Rydell, and also the American female singing group, the Cookies. Now, it didn't take long for Lisberg to see that regardless of the rest of this band, which was about to lose 2 of its members anyway, that this Noone kid had something going on. And so his business management instincts kicked in, and he realized that he needed to act fast before someone else got the same ideas about managing him that he was already starting to formulate in his own mind. Seeing that this kid was obviously too young to sign any legal contracts at the time, Lisberg asked if he might be able to meet with young Peter's parents, which is exactly what happened immediately following this show. He introduced himself, and he and Peter walked just like 3 or 4 blocks away from this venue through the quaint little suburb of Davyhulme. I hope I pronounced that right. Davyhulme, which is really famous for literally nothing else other than being the home of the single largest sewage treatment plant in all of Europe. And this is where Lisberg convinced Peter's parents that he should be the guy, still at the age of barely 23, to manage the career of this talented but still surprisingly unknown teenage musical prodigy. Well, they were charmed, and they agreed to sign an exclusive contract for Lisberg to represent Peter Noone and whatever band that he was associated with. And so, this guy Lisberg hits the ground running, and he works hard. He's booking them all over the Manchester area, and then later, he's booking them in places as far away as like Glasgow and London. Now, he had a more difficult time getting them booked in Liverpool, because what he was finding was that the clubs in that city, especially the Cavern Club, just didn't seem to want these Manchester bands playing there. And maybe they even looked down on them a little bit. They wanted to take care of the Liverpool bands first, and they kind of shunned these Manchester groups. That is, of course, until it became obvious that Herman's Hermits were being booked all over the UK. And so then places like the Cavern Club eventually gave in and booked them too. Because, well, money, of course. Money means everything in the end, and it generally trumps any petty rivalries or territorial grievances that any venue owner might harbor at first. Big things were going on in Manchester too at that time, and the young people there were very eager for new musical acts. This caused a real boom very suddenly in music venues because Manchester wanted to cash in on the same type of success of their rival city, Liverpool. They wanted to develop their own scene, and Herman's Hermits just seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Lisberg secured loans from his friends and various investors whom he had convinced that this band right here was about to take off in a very big way. He used that money to buy all of them new clothes. He bought them matching suits just like the Beatles. He bought them new and better equipment, and he also started pitching them to television programs. He managed to get them booked on a new musical program called The Scene at 6:30. And it was immediately after this performance on that show that they really did start taking off in the UK. This show wasn't produced in London. It was filmed in Manchester, and it aired only in the north part of England. Now, the Beatles had been on the show, and so had the Hollies. Peter Noone was a natural for this kind of thing, and he was a big hit with the television audience. Soon after this, the record labels and the big-time producers came calling. And this was when things started to get real, and also when things started becoming more cutthroat. There were demands that 2 of the members of the band at this time be removed and replaced with others who were a bit more photogenic and more charismatic. This demand was made to Lisberg, who was managing them full-time now, by the hottest hitmaker in the UK, Mickie Most. Do you remember him from the last episode about the Animals? Yep, it's him again. He was fresh off the huge success of the House of the Rising Sun single that was racing its way up the charts in several different countries at that time. And when he made demands, people felt like they needed to take him seriously, or else he would just stop returning their phone calls. So, they pulled a Pete Best on these 2 guys in the band in order to please Mickie Most. And they found a replacement drummer and a new bass player immediately. Derek Leckenby originally joined this group as the new bass player, but it was soon found out that he was even a better lead guitar player than Carl Green. And so these 2 guys swapped roles in the band right after that. Mickie Most then agreed that he would produce them, and he suggested that they record a song written by Goffin and King, and it was called I'm Into Something Good. Herman's Hermits ended up recording their first single at Delane Lee Studio in Soho, London, on the 26th of July, 1964. And roughly 4 weeks after that studio date, they had their very first top 40 hit in the UK. Right after that, they appeared on the BBC on the Top of the Pops, and the song went to #1 with a bullet. MGM Records in America soon got wind of all this, and by the end of 1964, the single had been released in America, and it too went right into the Billboard Hot 100, and it eventually peaked at number 13. So, that brings us up to the very beginning of 1965 in our story here. And this is also where the love affair with this group and the popular music-loving American public began. Peter Noone is now starting to grace the covers of teen pin-up magazines all over Europe and the United States. And by this point, he still hasn't even hit the age of 17. He's got the perfect, smiling, clean-cut boy next door image. And this is where we begin to get our answer to the question that was posed back at the beginning of this episode. This is just exactly what America wanted at this time. And they seemed to want it way more than even the UK did. The group was also a novelty because although it was known that the Beatles were definitely British, they didn't play up their Liverpool accents in the way that Peter Noone played up his own Manchester accent as he was singing. This was almost completely unheard of at that time, and American audiences just couldn't seem to get enough of all of it. And speaking of novelty, this is the direction that this band was headed for. And for the people who held the purse strings and the budget for this group, they decided that this was the best way to keep this group moving forward for as long as they possibly could ride out this wave of popularity. The group was really still not that much more than just a simple teenage cover band, and didn't really have much in the way of a super strong songwriter in the group. As I had just mentioned earlier, rhythm guitarist Keith Hopwood was able to drop in a couple of B-side filler material tracks into the equation every now and then, but it was more than painfully obvious that there was no Lennon or McCartney to be found within this group. This brings us up to the release of a couple of songs that fit squarely into the genre, if there is one, of the novelty song, and also two songs that ended up topping the American charts at number 1, but that weren't actually even released in the UK. The first one, Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter. It was this weird little ditty that had been kicking around in the UK for a few years that had been originally featured on a British television program called The Lads. It had become the kind of song that people sang at weddings or to kids at a birthday party, with the Mrs. Brown part of the title and the lyrics replaced with someone else's name, whoever it was who was being celebrated at whatever kind of party that it was. It was clearly not a song that anyone, other than possibly a brilliant producer like Mickie Most, would have ever thought would become a number 1 hit in America and Canada in the summer of 1965. Even the band, as eager as they were for a continual string of hit songs, were hesitant about it. In fact, they were even tricked into the idea of ever even recording it in the first place. And then they had no say whatsoever in this song being released as a single in the United States. In December of 1964, they were again in the studio in Soho with producer Mickie Most. They were recording other songs that were meant for the inclusion on an upcoming album. They currently had a hit song in the American charts, but as it always goes, the popularity of that song was beginning to fade, and Most and the American label MGM wanted more follow-up material from them in order to keep up the momentum and a continued interest in this band. British invasion groups like the Beatles, the Kinks, the Animals, and the Searchers were dominating the Billboard Hot 100 at that time, and Herman's Hermits had to keep up. And so, Mr. Most, during a smoke break in the sessions, just casually kind of comes up and says to the band, "Hey fellas, you know, what we need here now is just a short little throwaway number that's no more than 3 minutes in length, just to put in at the very end of side 2. And I think if we can do that, well, then we'll have enough songs to fill out the running time for this next record. Something like that. Now, the band had already recorded 11 songs that were planned for this record, but Most was not being totally honest with them. What he was actually looking for from them was something that was a little more silly and just completely unserious, something that he could market to MGM and to the American teenage audience. So what he did was he asked them if they had something that they could just simply and very quickly play for him so that he could just listen to it and then pick and choose what he wanted to use as the final pieces of filler material for this record. So Peter Noone innocently suggested this joke song that they had played often where he would get himself dressed up like an elementary schoolboy, and he would sing it in the most outrageous Oliver Twist accent, and it would always go over well with the young girls and their moms. Bingo. And so Mickey Most said, "Oh, really? Well, then why don't you just give it a go and let me hear it?" And so they did. And while they were getting ready to do that, he secretly and quietly reached over and hit the record button in the control booth. And that was that. And after they had played it just a single time, he said, "Hey, nice job. I think we got it, lads." And of course they were confused and even slightly horrified that he had just recorded them without letting them know his true intentions. And so after that, they were shown the door and sent off back home, back to Manchester, so that Mickey Most could then mix this song and then plot his next takeover of the American charts with this goofy little birthday party song, which is exactly what he did. And he did it very well. He sent the song over to his connections at MGM, and of course they just went ape over it. They initially offered to pay him and the band a sum of $600,000 for exclusive rights to the song with no strings attached based on sales. They would just pay that sum outright, knowing that they would easily recoup all of that money and more after it was all over. Now, mind you, that was $600,000 in 1964 dollars. That's the equivalent of over $6.1 million in the year 2025. And Mickey Most played hardball with them. In the end, MGM agreed to pay them the sum of $1 million for this silly little song that had never even been tested on an American market. And if you do the math, that's 10.2 million US dollars that this label paid for this song. This Mickey Most guy was just simply genius. The song was released in April of 1965, and within 2 weeks, it was already at number 1. MGM ended up recouping 3 times the amount of that money that they had just paid for it. So I guess they were all genius too. As for the band, they were initially embarrassed by this song. But of course, they got over that quickly enough as soon as they all started cashing the big checks. They had just become the biggest selling act in North America. And they're still all teenagers. After this, they were on the Dick Clark Show. They were on the Danny Kaye Show. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they filmed a movie in Hollywood called When the Boys Meet the Girls, which was really nothing more than just a bad ripoff of the Beatles movie Help. They went on tour with The Who. They went on tour with the Rolling Stones. And then to top it off, they recorded another ridiculous novelty song called I'm Henry VIII, I Am, which, by the way, is on this record right here. And I am not going to lie, is one of the most irritating songs that I can even think of from this entire era. Thank God that it is only 1 minute and 49 seconds long. They camped this one up with the same over-the-top accent as well as just more or less kind of gave into the idea that this kind of song was their forte and their bread and butter in 1965. They made even more money with this one than they did on the Mrs. Brown song. Now, here is where I want to let you in on a little secret. And it's not just with this particular band in question, but it's really more about something that went on back in those days a lot more often than you might think. Again, according to Mr. Lisberg, the band manager, in his own words, he described something that producer Mickey Most was notorious for back then, and that was the use of highly paid but uncredited virtuoso studio musicians who could come into the studio at the drop of a hat and play parts of songs or entire songs when his other, less experienced musicians just couldn't do it themselves. I hate to burst your bubble, but there is a very good chance that when you listen to this record right here, you may not even be hearing the actual guys in Herman's Hermits on several of these songs. And I'm talking more specifically about the guitar parts and the bass parts, and maybe even the drums. In fact, you may be hearing, unknowingly, a couple of other guys who you would never even guess might actually also be on this record. Here's one of them right here. Does he look even the slightest bit recognizable to you at all? Who is this clean-cut young musical professional? Well, this is John Paul Jones, who in just a few short years after this photo was taken, went on to even greater fame and fortune with a little band known as Led Zeppelin. Jones was a highly sought-after studio musician in the London area, and he was classically trained in music. He could sight-read musical charts, or he could just play almost anything by ear. He played keyboards, and he played the bass extremely well, and he also had skills in the areas of arrangement and songwriting. He probably played guitar too, but he didn't really have to because Mickey Most also had the phone number for this other guy. He might be recognizable to you as well. And yes, most of you have guessed it. This is Jimmy Page, also in his pre-Led Zeppelin days, and back then he was still going by the name James Page. He was also a guitar virtuoso and also who may be playing some of the guitar parts on this record. Now, these may sound simple to your ears, but you still have to keep in mind, they just did not have the musical editing capabilities back then that we take for granted today. If someone just couldn't stay in rhythm, or they were just constantly missing chords, messing up, or ruining what would otherwise be usable takes, then a producer like Mickey Most would just simply start to lose patience. And then he would start getting on the phone trying to bring in someone else. This guy was a glass eater, and he didn't care one single iota about a musician's feelings or whether or not they would be offended by being taken off of a song or out of a mix. As far as he was concerned, time was money, and studio time cost money. He had a single job to do, and that was to produce songs and records and to do so as absolutely as quickly and efficiently as possible. This is where people like John Paul Jones and James Page came in very handy for him because they did exactly as they were told. They worked quickly, and they usually nailed simple musical numbers like these in a single take. They collected their money, and then they just went back home. They are not credited or even mentioned anywhere in the liner notes on this record. But again, according to Harvey Lisberg, they were in the studio with Herman's Hermits on many, many different occasions. And I'm not just picking on these guys right here about any of this. Believe it or not, this was more of a common practice back then than you might realize. George Martin was also known to become very impatient with Ringo Starr and his drumming capabilities on some of those very early Beatles recordings. He would often call up this guy right here to come in whenever he would ask Ringo to step aside from the drum kit. This is Andy White, who you may or may not know was one of the busiest session drummers in the UK in the 1950s and the 1960s. He would come into Abbey Road Studios on short notice, and he would bang out, just some semi-complex rhythm parts on these Beatles songs, while Ringo sat in the back of the control booth and sulked about it. And also, by the way, I am not just making any of this up. That information comes from not only George Martin's writings, but also right from Ringo himself, who these days will just flat out tell you which Beatles songs he never actually recorded. I think he's gotten over all of that now at this point in his life. Anyway, back to the Hermits. As I brought up earlier, this party was starting to wrap up by early 1967, and the musical tastes, at least in America by that point, were beginning to shift over to things that were a bit more serious in nature, and more people were getting into the music of Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, the Byrds, and the Doors, etc. And it's probably a good thing for these young guys, because red flags were starting to go up everywhere, and there were signs on the wall that were pointing to stress. There was a constant stress to keep up, and also to start to be taken more seriously. I also said just a few minutes ago that the band ended up on a short tour with The Who. Well, Peter Noone thought that the antics of Keith Moon while out on tour were a hoot. I'm talking about the trashing of hotel rooms, the blowing up of toilets with cherry bombs, pushing cars into swimming pools, throwing television sets out of 10-story hotel rooms, etc. Well, young Peter here also tried his hand at this kind of behavior just a few times, until he was finally reined in by the other adults in the room. And he managed to smash up some bathroom mirrors and possibly maybe even tossed a couple of television sets into the swimming pool himself. But he never got anywhere close to the kinds of things that Keith Moon became notorious for. One of the more concerning incidents that actually did happen was during the time that they were in Los Angeles shooting that promotional film. A large house had been rented for the band in Benedict Canyon, which is right here, just to the west of Hollywood. He set off a panic amongst the rest of the band and their management group by simply disappearing from the house for a period of about 72 hours. After much asking around, they finally figured out that he had been spotted at a party in Laurel Canyon, which is way over here on the north side of the Sunset Strip. He was located in a house, drunk, and passed out in a bathtub. But all was well, and he sobered up, and he was perfectly fine. But that house, by the way, was owned by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Now, I am not about to get sidetracked off into talking about the checkered and sketchy reputation of John Phillips. All I will say is that he is definitely not the kind of person who you would want your teenage son to be hanging around with, especially not when alcohol or other types of drugs would have certainly been involved. And that's all I am really going to say about that. Just imagine yourself, if you were 15, 16, or 17 years old, and you constantly had people taking care of every single aspect of your daily, professional, and personal life. Imagine if you had made more money in a single 3-year period than you ever would for the rest of your entire life. That might seem kind of nice. Nice, that is, until everything changed around you and somehow the rug just got pulled out from under your feet before you even hit the age of 20. Personally, I think this would cause emotional problems for most people at that age. But then again, I guess I wouldn't really know. What I do know is that the Hermits actually stuck around, through these lean years up until round about 1972. That's when it all dissolved and they just all sort of went their separate ways. They were a nostalgia act by that point, and I think they just got tired of it. Peter Noone went on to have a modest but actually very successful music career, and he's still alive and he's still working. Some of these other guys who had talents in their own right also went on to do other things in music, and they too built careers that lasted well into their old age or into their final years. The two guitar players, Derek Leckenby and Keith Hopwood, well, they ended up forming a company called Pluto Music. They wrote scores for films and cartoons and commercials, and they ended up being partners from that point on in their lives until Leckenby, unfortunately, died of cancer at the young age of 51. They had retained the rights to the band name, and they would often get together with other past bandmates, and they launched very successful nostalgia tours all over the world. They would go out with other Mersey beat bands, such as the Searchers, and they even went on tour once with the Monkees, which sounds to me like would have been a perfect pairing for both of these bands. Peter Noone himself never joined in on these tours. He had his own career going, and it has been said that he was never really that terribly fond of these other guys taking that band name out on the road with them and without him. But you know what? You do what you gotta do to make a living. Keith Hopwood just released a solo album in 2022 called Never Too Late. Okay, so let's go ahead and get on with the review of this record. And honestly, it's not really going to take that long. There's not a whole lot to unpack here. I think that we have made it quite obvious that we regard this lovable little group as a novelty act, and they were never designed or even envisioned to be a long-term group that was going to grow or mature into anything that was going to be remembered for decades after they were gone. Now, they are remembered in many ways, all right? And it's not fair to ever call them anything like a one-hit wonder. They were more like a 15-hit wonder, and they made a lot of money for themselves and for the people who managed and produced them. But the world is fickle, and when something gets used up or hangs around too long, wears out its welcome, well, it tends to disappear and become forgotten rather quickly. The only mild highlight on this record for us was the third song on side one. It's called The End of the World. And the highlight of it is that it's just simply a pleasant listen. There are some very nice but subtle vocal harmonies on that one, and it just kind of reminded us of something that you might have heard from like a very young Barry Gibb in the Bee Gees. And it felt like it was the most mature song on the record in terms of its lyrics and just in terms of its overall presentation, because they're not going for a really big hit on this one. And that was actually very refreshing. The song right after that was a very familiar one that was made famous by the Yardbirds in that same year. It's called For Your Love. And they almost pulled it off, but it just didn't have any balls to it. I don't really know what else to say about their version of this song. It's a great song, but on this record, it's just fluff. Most of the record is actually a pleasant listen, but it is not memorable enough overall to warrant anything that is higher than a 6.1 on our grading scale. And that, folks, is a D-. So, do we recommend this one to be in your collection? No. Sorry, but there's just way too many other great records out there, and too many other great records from this same time period to warrant spending any money on this one. They're trying really, really hard here to sound like the Beatles. But what they actually sound like is if the Beatles had lacked confidence and were trying to sound like any other Mersey beat band from 1963 who were also trying to sound like the Beatles, if that makes any sense at all. Please come back and join us again for the next episode in our Vinyl Review Countdown. This next time, we're going back to America, and more specifically, we're going into the Los Angeles area of Laurel Canyon. There was a brand new group that was living out there at the time, and they were about to drop something on us that was actually a very revolutionary sound at that time. I don't think even they may have understood just how important that record was going to be or how influential it would eventually become. It was a good one. I'm talking about the Byrds, and I'm talking about their debut album called Mr. Tambourine Man. I really want you to see this one. Once again, this is Billy with Wolf River Music, and you have been watching the Vinyl Review. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.